What if the most dangerous man in your life was the quiet one downstairs? What if the person who smiled politely in the hallway, who helped carry groceries, who spoke softly, respectfully, carefully, was studying you, not with desire, not with affection, but with calculation? How does a man live among neighbors for years? Share walls, share air, share ordinary conversations, while hiding something unspeakable behind that ordinary face? Was he born empty? Did something fracture early? Or was this something colder, something deliberate? Tonight, we step inside the domestic world of a man who did not look monstrous. We examine charm without warmth, politeness without empathy, control without conscience. And as we move through his life, you may begin to ask yourself, how many warning signs can hide behind normal? Before we analyze the crimes, we must understand the mask. John Reginald Halliday Christie was not loud. He was not physically imposing. He did not radiate aggression in the obvious way many people expect from violent offenders. He blended in, and that is precisely why his case remains psychologically disturbing. Christie understood something many predators understand instinctively. Trust is easier to gain when you appear harmless, soft-spoken, mild-mannered, helpful, ordinary. He lived in shared domestic space, the most intimate environment outside of family. Neighbors passed him on staircases. Tenants lived under the same roof. Conversations happened within arm's reach of secrets. Domestic proximity creates psychological comfort. When someone shares your building, your hallway, your daily rhythm, your brain categorizes them as safe. Repeated exposure reduces perceived threat. Familiarity dulls suspicion. This is where earlier chapters begin to echo. Remember the concept of emotional detachment, the ability to see people not as full human beings but as roles, as utilities, as objects. Christie displayed traits consistent with that detachment. Outwardly compliant, inwardly calculating, he presented himself as sympathetic, sometimes even medically knowledgeable, positioning himself as someone who could help. And here we encounter a key psychological mechanism: abuse of authority cues. Humans are wired to respond to perceived expertise. A calm voice, confident explanations, a sense of medical or technical understanding. When someone appears informed, our critical thinking often softens. Predators who exploit this do not overpower physically at first. They overpower psychologically. Christie cultivated that advantage. He created an atmosphere where doubt felt impolite. That is crucial. Politeness can silence instinct. If something feels slightly off, but the person is courteous, respectful, measured, we hesitate. We question ourselves instead of them. Maybe I'm overthinking. He seems nice. I don't want to be rude. And in that hesitation, manipulation deepens. Christie's planning was not impulsive rage. It was methodical. He prepared environments. He rehearsed explanations. He maintained composure. This aligns with the earlier concept of the prefrontal cortex, functioning effectively, not failing. His actions were not chaotic explosions. They were structured. That distinction matters. Not all extreme violence comes from loss of control. Some come from controlled deception. Imagine the psychological duality required. Engaging in small talk while concealing predatory intent. Maintaining a routine. Paying rent. Conversing about weather. All while compartmentalizing something far darker. Compartmentalization is a powerful defense mechanism. It allows individuals to separate incompatible identities into mental boxes. The neighbor box. The private fantasy box, the social self box. Most people compartmentalize harmless things, work stress separate from home life, personal worries separate from public roles. In Christie's case, compartmentalization allowed normalcy to coexist with predation. The absence of visible guilt is what unsettles many observers. How does someone sit calmly after deception? How does someone resume ordinary life without visible psychological collapse? Earlier we discussed reduced fear response and moral disengagement. If empathy circuits are muted, if guilt pathways are weakened, if the internal alarm barely rings, then behavior that would devastate one person may not destabilize another. This does not mean he felt nothing at all. Human emotion is rarely binary. But it suggests that remorse did not override intention. Christie's manipulation often involved creating control. Scenarios, isolation, privacy, dependence, these are common tools of trust-based offenders. They minimize resistance and maximize psychological dominance. Dominance here is not loud or theatrical. It is quiet control. He did not rely on brute force alone. He relied on persuasion, on positioning himself as helpful, on exploiting vulnerability. And vulnerability often exists in ordinary settings. Financial hardship, housing insecurity, social isolation. When someone offers assistance in those moments, gratitude lures defenses. Christie understood that dynamic. He moved within domestic space, like someone who belonged there. Because he did belong there, that is what makes the case chilling. There was no dramatic outsider breaking in. The threat lived inside the structure. This forces us to confront a difficult reality. Danger does not always look chaotic. Sometimes it looks routine. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it holds doors open. As we continue deeper into this case, we will examine how meticulous planning intersected with emotional detachment, how manipulation escalated, and how normalcy shielded horror for far too long. Because the most disturbing question is not simply what he did. It is how long he remained unseen. When investigators later examined the life of John Reginald Halliday Christie, one detail stood out again and again: the quietness. Not just his personality, but the quiet rhythm of his daily life. Nothing about his routine screamed danger. Nothing about his presence suggested the kind of psychological darkness that investigators would eventually uncover. And this is what makes cases like Christie's so unsettling. The distance between appearance and reality can be enormous. People often imagine violent offenders as visibly unstable, angry, unpredictable, or socially isolated in obvious ways. But Christie did not present himself like that. He lived inside the ordinary world. He spoke politely. He navigated daily interactions with restraint. In the social psychology of deception, this is known as behavioral camouflage, blending so smoothly into social expectations that suspicion struggles to find a foothold. Camouflage works best when it mirrors what people expect to see. A calm neighbor, a quiet tenant, a person who minds his own business. The more someone fits those expectations, the less energy others spend evaluating them critically. Our brains conserve effort by trusting familiar patterns. Christie benefited from this deeply human shortcut. Yet beneath that surface existed a different psychological structure. Earlier chapters explored how some individuals experience weakened emotional response to the suffering of others. Empathy, which normally acts like an internal alarm system, can function very differently depending on personality traits, neurological development, and life experiences. For most people, imagining harm to another person produces discomfort. The mind resists the idea. It triggers emotional friction. That friction becomes a barrier against cruelty. But in certain individuals, that barrier is thin or sometimes nearly absent. In Christie's case, many analysts believe this emotional detachment allowed him to compartmentalize behavior that would normally shatter a person's self-image, to maintain an ordinary social role while secretly operating under a completely different internal logic. Imagine the mental architecture required for that. Two identities coexisting in the same life. One identity interacts with neighbors, speaks politely, maintains a routine. The other identity operates in secrecy, driven by impulses and fantasies that cannot survive public exposure. Most people cannot sustain that split for long. Stress leaks through. Guilt surfaces. Fear destabilizes them. But some offenders demonstrate remarkable psychological containment. They isolate their hidden behavior inside mental compartments, so tightly sealed that even prolonged social contact fails to expose the truth. Christie appeared to possess that ability. Another element that made his manipulation effective was the use of authority cues. Authority does not always come from official power. Sometimes it comes from tone, language, and confidence. If someone speaks with calm certainty about health, safety, or technical knowledge, others may unconsciously assign them credibility. Christie occasionally used this perception to position himself as someone who understood medical matters or could provide assistance. In social psychology, this technique is subtle but powerful. When a person appears knowledgeable, people often suspend skepticism out of respect. This does not require dramatic lies. Often, it only requires confidence. And confidence disarms. Victims in many trust-based crimes later describe the same feeling. Nothing initially felt threatening. The situation seemed normal. The person seemed reasonable. This is how manipulation begins. Not with obvious force, but with gradual control of the environment, isolation, privacy, reduce witnesses. A shift from public interaction to private influences. Christie's environment provided opportunities for that shift. Shared domestic spaces can create moments where individuals become temporarily separated from the safety of public observation. Staircases, hallways, private rooms, places that feel routine but remove social visibility. Routine spaces are powerful because they feel safe by default. The brain rarely expects danger in familiar environments. That expectation gap is what predators sometimes exploit. When the mind anticipates safety, it reacts more slowly to warning signals. And warning signals may have existed in many historical investigations. Neighbors later recall small details that seemed strange only in hindsight. A conversation that felt slightly uncomfortable. A moment of awkward silence. A vague unease that was dismissed at the time. Human intuition is sensitive to microsignals, tone shifts, eye contact patterns, subtle inconsistencies. But intuition often competes with politeness. People hesitate to act on vague discomfort because social norms encourage harmony. We do not want to accuse the wrong person. We do not want to create conflict, so we explain away the feeling. Christie's ability to remain composed allowed him to navigate those moments without triggering alarm. Calmness can neutralize suspicion. When someone reacts to questions without visible stress, observers often assume innocence. But composure can be learnt, practiced, refined. Many manipulative personalities study social reactions carefully. They learn which behaviors reassure others and which provoke doubt. Over time, they refine their outward performance until it becomes automatic. In Christie's life, this performance extended across years. That length of time is important. Sustained deception requires discipline. It requires the ability to maintain routine, control impulses, and avoid drawing attention. This contradicts the stereotype of the uncontrollable monster. Instead, what we see is calculated patience. Patience can be far more dangerous than rage. Rage burns quickly. It attracts attention. It creates noise. Patience waits. Patience observes. Patience studies the patterns of other people until it finds moments where control can be exercised without immediate consequence. This is why investigators later describe Christie as methodical, not impulsive, not reckless. His behavior suggested someone who understood the value of timing and secrecy. And secrecy thrives in environments where trust already exists. When neighbors share walls, daily life creates assumptions of familiarity. People hear footsteps, voices, doors opening and closing. Over time, those sounds fade into background noise. Routine becomes invisibility. This is one reason domestic crimes can remain hidden longer than crimes committed in public spaces. Familiarity dulls attention. People stop analyzing the environment because nothing appears unusual. But hidden patterns may still be unfolding behind closed doors. Christie's case forces investigators and listeners to confront a disturbing possibility. The most effective manipulations often occur not through dramatic acts of intimidation, but through quiet psychological positioning. Appear calm, appear helpful, appear trustworthy, and allow the mask to do the rest. As we move deeper into this chapter, the focus shifts from the mask itself to the psychology that allowed Christie to maintain it for so long, because behind every successful deception lies an internal system, beliefs, fantasies, and rationalizations that make the behavior possible. Understanding that internal system does not excuse the actions, but it does reveal how someone can live among ordinary people and remain invisible. The most dangerous deception is not the lie you tell others. It is the story you tell yourself. For men like John Reginald Halliday Christie, the internal narrative becomes a quiet engine running beneath ordinary life. While the outside world sees routine, a neighbor, a tenant, a polite man moving through the rhythm of daily existence, the private mind begins constructing a different reality. A reality where control matters more than connection, where other people slowly lose their full humanity and become pieces inside a psychological framework built around dominance. This transformation rarely appears suddenly. It evolves gradually, layer by layer, thought by thought. In the beginning, the fantasies may seem abstract even to the person imagining them. A curiosity about power, a fascination with control, a desire to feel superior in situations where others appear vulnerable. For most individuals, those thoughts fade quickly because empathy interrupts them. The brain introduces emotional resistance. It reminds the person that another human being exists on the other side of that fantasy. But when empathy is weakened, the interruption never arrives. Instead, the mind begins exploring the fantasy further. And this is where the psychology of escalation begins. Christie's behavior suggested a mind capable of separating imagination from public identity so effectively that the two rarely collided. During the day, he could function like any other resident of a shared building, exchanging greetings, maintaining small conversations, observing social norms. Yet internally, the private narrative continued developing. Psychologists often refer to this as dual reality processing. A person maintains one reality for social survival and another for private gratification. The social reality follows rules, politeness, restraint, predictability. The private reality follows impulses, curiosity about control, fascination with dominance, a desire to experiment with power. The longer those realities remain separate, the stronger the private one can become, and secrecy feeds that strength. Secrecy is intoxicating for certain personalities because it creates a sense of superiority. The person believes they possess knowledge or experiences that others cannot see. That hidden layer becomes proof in their mind that they are smarter, more capable, more powerful than the people around them. In Christie's environment, that secrecy existed inside a place where ordinary life continued just outside the walls. People walked through hallways, doors opened and closed, conversations echoed through thin floors and ceilings. The normal world remained active, and yet the hidden world remained invisible. That contrast can amplify the offender's sense of control. Every ordinary interaction becomes confirmation that the disguise is working. Every polite conversation becomes proof that no one understands what is really happening beneath the surface. For someone driven by psychological dominance, that realization can feel empowering. It creates a dangerous feedback loop. The more successfully the deception works, the more confident the offender becomes in their ability to maintain it. Confidence leads to experimentation. Experimentation leads to escalation. This process does not always happen quickly. In some offenders, it unfolds slowly over years. Patience allows them to refine their behavior, study reactions, and adapt strategies that reduce risk. Christie appeared to demonstrate this patience. His interactions were not explosive or theatrical. Instead, they were quiet and controlled, carefully shaped to maintain the image of harmlessness. Even when speaking with others, he reportedly maintained a calm demeanor that discouraged confrontation. Calmness is a powerful psychological shield. When someone appears relaxed and cooperative, observers rarely imagined that a darker intention exists behind the composure. Anger attracts attention. Nervousness triggers suspicion. But calm politeness tends to dissolve both. That calmness allowed Christie to operate inside a shared domestic environment without triggering immediate alarm. And domestic environments are unique in the psychology of trust. Inside a home or residential building, people lower their guard. They expect privacy, familiarity, and routine. The brain treats the space as protected territory, not a place where extreme danger should exist. When a threat emerges from within that territory, the shock is magnified because it violates a deep expectation of safety. This is why cases like Christie's continue to disturb audiences decades later. They reveal how easily the brain's trust systems can be manipulated by someone willing to mimic normal behavior. The mimicry becomes a performance. But like any performance, it requires rehearsal. Observers later described Christie as someone who spoke carefully, sometimes slowly, as if choosing words with precision. This detail may seem minor, but it suggests a mind constantly monitoring how it appeared to others. Self-monitoring is common in manipulative personalities. They watch reactions closely. They adjust tone, posture, and language in response to subtle cues. Over time, this skill becomes automatic. The person learns exactly how much friendliness to display, exactly how much distance to maintain, exactly how much information to reveal. Too much enthusiasm can appear suspicious. Too little interaction can appear strange. So the offender walks a narrow line between the two. That balancing act requires mental energy, but it also produces a strange form of satisfaction. Each successful interaction reinforces the belief that the deception is perfect, and perfection invites risk, because eventually the offender begins to believe they cannot be discovered. This psychological shift from caution to confidence often marks a turning point in criminal behavior. Once someone believes they are intellectually superior to everyone around them, their decisions begin to change. They may take greater risks. They may experiment with more elaborate manipulation. In Christie's case, investigators later recognized signs of that confidence in the way he navigated his social environment. Neighbors did not describe a man under visible stress. They described someone who seemed normal. That word appears again and again in accounts of people who interacted with him. Normal. But normal is a mask that can be learned. And the longer a mask remains in place, the more convincing it becomes, not only to others, but sometimes even to the person wearing it. Christie's ability to maintain that mask inside an ordinary residential setting reveals something deeply unsettling about human psychology. The mind is capable of constructing identities so convincing that entire communities can live beside them without recognizing the truth. The question then becomes not simply how the deception worked, but how long it could have continued if circumstances had not eventually shifted. Because the most disturbing reality about hidden predators is this: their success depends not only on their own behavior, but on how much the world around them expects normalcy to equal safety. And sometimes, the most dangerous individual in a building is the one who appears to fit perfectly into its quiet routine. The most frightening predators are not always the loudest ones. They are the quiet observers, the ones who learn how people behave, how they trust, how they dismiss small discomforts. Because everyday life feels too ordinary to contain real danger. By the time investigators began unraveling the life of John Reginald Halliday Christie, a disturbing psychological portrait had begun to form. Not a portrait of chaos or explosive rage, but one of quiet manipulation. A man who understood how to position himself inside the trust systems of ordinary life. And that positioning was the key. Christie did not operate from the margins of society, where suspicion naturally gathers. He lived inside routine environments, shared walls, common hallways, spaces where neighbors exchanged greetings and passed each other without hesitation. Routine is powerful because it rewires perception. When you see the same person repeatedly in a familiar setting, the brain begins categorizing them as part of the environment, like furniture in a room, like a street you walk every day. Eventually, your mind stops actively evaluating them. They simply belong there. And once someone becomes part of the background of everyday life, their behavior receives far less scrutiny. This psychological effect is sometimes called normalization through repetition. The more frequently a person appears harmless, the harder it becomes to imagine them as dangerous. Christie understood this environment well. He moved through it slowly, carefully, reinforcing the same impression again and again. A quiet man who kept to himself. Someone who caused no trouble. Someone who did not attract attention. That absence of attention was not accidental. It was strategy. Predators who rely on manipulation rather than impulsive aggression often recognize that. Visibility is the enemy. The less people discuss you, the less people analyze your behavior. Silence becomes protection. Christie cultivated that silence. Neighbors later struggled to recall anything memorable about him because nothing about his daily behavior demanded memory. He did not create dramatic confrontations. He did not behave in ways that would circulate through neighborhood gossip. Instead, he blended in so completely that many people remembered him only vaguely. And that vagueness is one of the most effective disguises a manipulative personality can create. Because people rarely suspect what they barely notice. Another aspect of Christie's psychology that analysts often discuss is control through environment. Rather than confronting situations where unpredictability could expose him, he preferred controlled settings, places where he understood the layouts, the timing, the presence or absence of witnesses. Control reduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is what exposes deception. By minimizing unpredictable elements, Christie increased the stability of his hidden life. Each controlled interaction strengthened the illusion that everything around him was ordinary. But perception always contains a fragile element. Even the most disciplined offender must maintain the illusion continuously. Every conversation, every movement, every interaction becomes part of the performance. Over time, maintaining that performance requires increasing psychological effort. Some offenders begin making mistakes under that pressure. Others grow overconfident and take risks that eventually reveal the truth. In Christie's case, investigators later recognize how long the illusion had survived before cracks began appearing. And when those cracks finally formed, the contrast between his public image and the reality behind it shocked the entire community. This shock is common in cases involving manipulative personalities. People struggle to reconcile the person they believe they knew with the actions that later come to light. Friends say he seemed normal. Neighbors say he was polite. Acquaintances say, I never would have imagined. These reactions reveal something important about human psychology. We expect danger to announce itself. We expect violent individuals to look unstable, angry, or socially alien. When someone behaves politely and maintains composure, we unconsciously place them inside the category of safety. Christie exploited that expectation, and his case forces investigators, psychologists, and audiences to confront a difficult truth. Outward behavior can be engineered. Social masks can be learned. The signals we rely on to identify trustworthiness can be deliberately imitated. That does not mean everyone is secretly dangerous. The overwhelming majority of people are exactly who they appear to be. Ordinary individuals living ordinary lives, but it does mean that appearances alone cannot always reveal intention. Christie's story illustrates the extreme edge of that reality. A man capable of maintaining a calm public identity, while hiding darker impulses that the people around him could not see. When cases like this are studied, the goal is not fascination with the offender. It is understanding the psychological mechanisms that allowed the deception to survive. Because when we understand those mechanisms, manipulation, emotional detachment, environmental control, and the strategic use of normal behavior, we begin to recognize how trust can sometimes be exploited, and that awareness is powerful. It reminds us that intuition should never be ignored simply because someone appears polite. It reminds us that confidence and charm are not the same as integrity. And it reminds us that the quietest individual in a room may still be living an internal life that no one else can see. The story of John Reginald Halliday Christie is disturbing not only because of the crimes associated with his name, but because of the psychological lesson it leaves behind. Sometimes it moves through the world quietly, wearing the calm face of ordinary life, waiting for the moment when nobody is looking. And that realization may be the most unsettling part of all.